The Lead Icon Podcast.
Shape the future. Lead with purpose. Go iconic.
Karl, lovely to meet you formally online. We've been toing and froing now for a few weeks. It's great to meet you.
No, you too. Thanks for having me on.
Karl, the reason why I reached out to you, well, my team and I reached out to you, is because we are obsessed with this organizational culture, and particularly going into 2025, we want to, today's discussion is pretty much about what do businesses need to know about organizational culture. We've seen, in the paper, problems at Qantas and, at other notable like networks like Nine. And what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? But before we get to that, let us know a little bit more about you and how did you get to where you are today? What made you get down this path of culture and branding?
I think I grew up in a house with, a very dedicated psychologist and philosopher as a father. So we didn't go to the pub and talk about the football or throw darts or go to the cricket. We talked about Freud and Nietzsche and Jung and Kierkegaard and different sort of theories around the human condition. So I don't know that I actually chose a lot of that. I was sort of brought up into that experience. And my fascination just increased as I grew into an adult particularly around choice modeling and the things that people choose and for what reason, both be it the brands they choose to support them in their lives or the people that they choose to have around them. And so that interest and that curiosity around the human condition sort of led me to a variety of different things. And now sort of 25 years on, I look after two teams, or I drive two teams, the Brand Institute and the Culture Institute of Australia, and we are dedicated to understanding those relationships in detail.
And running two organizations, that's not an easy feat, is it? So how do you manage your time in doing so?
Well, I think it's a good question, and it's an important question because a lot of people have this idea that they want to run their own show and, everything's better if you do. It depends on who you are as to how well you'll go with that. So I should say I'm largely unemployable. So I haven't had a job for 30 years. And even then I probably lasted 6 months. So I'm very much hardwired to create, develop, and because of my particular sociocultural profile and the way that I think, I'm part creative and part orderly or organized. So for me, that's quite helpful because I can do many jobs at once. But I do say there's a failing in that as well, in that, I'm not the greatest team player. I'm also wouldn't put my hand up to say that I'm the greatest leader. I think I'm pretty good at being a student around teams and leadership, and particularly culture, and looking for key information that I can decipher and share. So it's really horses for courses. The idea of having your own business and doing well at that, in Australia, most of our economy is based on small business. So we know how to do that better than many other countries. But yes, it is really difficult, and discipline is the key. I'm also extremely disciplined as a person. So that doesn't mean overly analytical and organized, but it means being very clear on what I will and won't do, and being very clear on the strategy that we're looking to double down on.
Who do you think influenced your entrepreneurial spirit? I know you mentioned, that you had amazing conversations with your father, on philosophers and those sorts of areas. So who do you think was, who sort of not pushed you, but sparked this desire to be creative and yet run your own show?
I think one of the things that we did early on, I grew up in a house that was a Buddhist family. So we did a lot of meditation, a lot of self-reflection. And so I wasn't necessarily heavily influenced from the outside in, it was more the inside out. So getting to know myself, my sense of self, and what felt right for me at a very, very deep level at an early age, it was very clear that I wanted to and probably had the ability to be a bit more challenging, to deal with uncertainty more so than others. I think that's the dark side of all of this, is when you have your own business or several businesses, and I've got 3 at the moment, You never really know what's around the corner. A global recession, financial crisis, COVID, all these things you've got to navigate literally on your own.
That's a really important point you've just made, Karl, because, when you think about the external forces that hit a business, and I was speaking to, friends the other day, and we were saying how if you've set up the right moat around your business and you set up the right, I guess, levers like financial, organizational, operational, you can pretty much adapt and probably withstand a few things. What do you think small business is getting wrong in that area?
I think small business, look, I don't know. I think a lot of them are getting things right, but I think the whole learning journey is a big one. And the things that are a bit more surprising than others is, I think, the constant financial drain due to our taxation system and the requirements that are on small business. I think they're tightening at the moment. I think in the years gone by, you would still have to have a legitimate value proposition and good client base and reputation to do well. But you had a little bit more leeway, I think, with a variety of federal taxes to be able to invest back in your business. And I think that's starting to move towards a more restrictive process. So I think that's probably the first thing, is the constant financial pressure that comes with this. We're in a really cluttered market in basically every market at the moment. So differentiation and distinction and having something literally valuable to say is critical. On the other hand, you can't be too far ahead. We spent many, many years being too far down the trail, deep in research, presenting solutions that the world was ready for 7 years later. And you can't financially succeed with that particular strategy. You have to model for the time.
You're so right. When I started this business, I started it out of an incubator at Macquarie University. And I was working, like, you'd have other, startups there also. And there was one gentleman there that had his startup for 14 years. And he was, he was getting funding for it, which was doing well, but he was ahead of his time. And it almost became redundant, in the end. So you're absolutely right. Now, what do you think in terms of, now if we move to HR and culture,
Sure.
What do you see as the most significant challenges in these areas, moving forward over the next, few years?
I think that the biggest issue historically and also in the future is putting HR and culture in the same sentence. Culture is in foster care whilst it's in HR. Culture is the responsibility of the board and the executive team and the CEO, and HR is an enabler. So whilst organizations continue to give sole responsibility to HR for culture, you can expect that to fail 100% of the time.
I've seen that too. And you're so right. So are you seeing a shift into that where boards are taking on culture more, or do you think there's still a lot more work to do to educate both the sort of departments?
I think it's both. We are seeing it more, but largely to your earlier point that there's been large reputation scandal that's driven boards and executive teams into this. They've had to face into it, particularly the high-profile cases that you mentioned. However, the education component remains, because when they look into culture, there's not a universal understanding of what culture is and what good cultural governance and cultural leadership is in Australia. There's very little, if any, higher education around culture for MBAs, for any sort of leadership program. And that's really our mission, is to help leaders ensure that they understand their primary responsibility is to lead others and create and foster culture. And so the things that got them to their leadership role are really the things that will help them succeed to become a cultural leader. So they need to really put some of the things down that got them to their individual success, and they need to start looking at this as a collective, through a collective lens.
Karl, that's so true. But how do you solve the problem of, if the board is looking after the culture, CEO is looking after the culture, you look at the board meets once a month, right? And then they're off doing, most board members are either, doing it voluntarily, or if they are paid board members, they're on a few boards. So how would a CEO then set up would you need a department purely for culture?
No, I don't think so. I think one of the key 2 or 3 responsibilities of the CEO is to deliver a healthy, high-performing culture that drives the strategy. So it's for the CEO to determine what to do. We have a particular process. There's a variety of processes in place that gets the board to set the tone. And when you say set the tone, people don't really know what that means. Essentially, all that means is to elevate its importance. And what does the culture not look and feel like? Because the board will not, to your point, have a say in that. They won't have the relevant touch points, regardless of however many questions they will ask. So the board just need to have it as a key priority in terms of their responsibility. The CEO then needs to operationalize that. And culture is a lot more akin to operations than it is HR. If the old definition of how we do things around here is right, which is quite a boring, nebulous, disengaging definition, it still probably is the thing that most people would say. But if that's right, well, how we do things is how do we operationalize our strategy? And so it becomes a key imperative for the organization, not a social agenda or social aspect of the company.
So how has Culture Institute evolved with what we're discussing? So when did you start Culture Institute?
Yeah, well, we started in 2003 in the States. So we started as an IPG or Interpublic startup in New York. And that came out of, I was working in big advertising in New York at the time, and we were creating a lot of brand promises that were compelling, setting large expectations. And it occurred to me that there was no real connection between the expectations set through the advertised promise and the in-person experience. So we went into experience design before experience design was really something, just to say, how do we make sure that a customer who's been sold something is delivered that? That was essentially the whole thing. And so that business grew over the sort of 10 years, and we tried a variety of things. What we found through a variety of mistakes was getting an employee to understand the brand promise and then change their behavior is a core cultural aspect. We thought it was a communication project where you just sort of tell them, here's a behavioral code or here's things you need to do. It became very clear that we need to really get involved in their psychological contract with the company. Why am I here? What is it that I need to do and for what reason? And from that led to the whole dashboard of culture for us for the last 15 years, which is a bespoke proprietary diagnostic suite that gives us exactly what we need in terms of cultural health, be it psychosocial hazard identification or psychological safety, cues of belonging, toxicity scores, culture style index, all the way through to what we're delivering now, which is bespoke cultural development for generally large organizations, or cultural leadership development for current or aspiring leaders, particularly around culture.
That's very good and very important. Like they say, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? And it's really true. Now, in terms of organizational culture, what importance does that play in brand perception?
Well,
when we're talking internally to start with, because culture starts within and then permeates out, right? So
yeah. So, but the brand question is a big one because brands are misunderstood concept as well. So, if we're talking about internally, so employee brand pride, is that what we mean? Well, I think that's heavily increased, and at the moment, because of the need and the desire for employees, particularly younger generations, to be part of something that's values and purpose-based. So if they feel that that's the case, they're more likely to be engaged. And so the internal brand is much stronger, and brand pride is bolstered as a result of that. I think the other part of that is reputation. So the customer perception of an organization, again, has seen a big increase in their interest in cultural practices, in terms of their desire to purchase, become loyal advocates for an organization.
That brand pride that you just mentioned, very important, because I'm noticing within organizations that the brand does not get reinforced as much as it could. So, through assets and through cultural, I guess, assets also.
Mm.
So where do you think, what are some, one, two things that businesses can do to improve that, the brand pride?
Well, brand pride will come from a variety of measures. The main thing every company needs to do is realize that if culture is left to its own devices, it becomes tribal, and tribes go to war. And when tribes are at war, psychological safety doesn't exist. So to even just start with, in terms of brand pride, the first thing is people need to feel safe. They need to feel recognized, seen, heard. And that sense of recognition and being heard then enables them to build emotional ties between themselves and their employer. That's when we sort of switch into a different lens for most employees, where they look to the customer value proposition. So they've gone from their own self-perception of, am I satisfied? Do I feel comfortable, safe? Into what are we delivering for our customers and society, and how do I feel about that? And that's where we start to see brand pride move.
Psychological safety is really important, Karl. And what are you seeing? What shifts are you seeing in, the area of mental well-being? Because, we've come out of the pandemic where we're seeing, I'm still seeing a lot of trauma.
Yep.
And also companies are trying to, reevaluate themselves and reinvent themselves at the same time. Where do you see mental well-being playing a part in psychological safety? And I know it's separate to culture, but it's still an important aspect of culture.
Yeah, psychological safety for us is built in. It's the foundation of any culture. So psychological safety and positive effect. So that sense of positivity. You're not going to get a psychologically safe environment generally without leaders becoming intimately aware of what drives psychological safety. And I think that's probably where we move into the mental health question, which is for leaders to drive psychological safety, they have to become very aware of their own existence and the way that they choose to live, and their drivers and their needs in particular. And they need to become incredible listeners for their employees' needs. Now, that's really difficult for a lot of companies, particularly off the back of AI entering into the workforce and the increased workload as a result of that. So in terms of mental health, what we're seeing is an increase in burnout, an increase in what is it? It's mostly burnout, but also fatigue. And fatigue's coming from not just the long hours, and you've seen the government sort of step in and make some changes around that, but the fatigue's coming from not just switch off times, but also volume of work and limited understanding from leaders as to this new balance that most people have, where they are balancing more aspects of their personal life with their professional life off the back of COVID. And that we're still in a tension point there between shareholders and organizations demanding people back in the office, and individuals who have set up their lives now in a habitual manner where they are balancing their work and their life more evenly.
So in terms of those solutions that you've just offered, are you seeing more programs being brought into organizations to support, employee well-being, if we use that word? Now, for larger organizations, they have, I guess, the means. But what about smaller organizations? And I'm talking about, organizations that can have, from say 5 to then 50 to 100 employees. So if you've got somebody who's got 5 employees, you still have a company culture, because you've got. So what can smaller size businesses do in this arena? Because everyone's wearing 10 hats and
yeah. I think it comes down to your investment slate. What are you going to pay for? I think everyone should have an EAP or some sort of psychological program available for their employees. They don't need to prepay for it, but at least have some sort of arrangement in place so that if people need it, it's readily available. They're not searching for psychological help. You also have a hell of a lot of smaller consultancies that work with small businesses now, and individuals that have come out of small or medium-sized companies that are dedicated to this. And we partner with a company called Exona. They're a couple of people that came out of one of the insurance companies, and they came out of HR and they saw the need to really help and bolster the concept of mental health. And they provide, self-assessments, checklists, a variety of things that don't cost anything. And then you can engage them on a consultancy basis if you need to. And there's others. I mean, the wellbeing space is very crowded at the moment, with people who are available to help. Whether they're any good or not, that's another question. But the fact that there are people out there putting their hand up to say, I'm keen to help, is a really great sign.
Okay. Now, brand loyalty.
Yep.
What do you think will be the emerging trends around this area, in the coming years?
I mean, it's extremely category specific. So it's always going to come down to value proposition, and in particular, individualistic value. So what is it doing for me? And not just what is it doing for me in terms of its function, but what does it say about me? And because of things like Instagram in particular, the brands that people are choosing has changed over time in that they need to reflect part of who they are more so. Nike's obviously fallen off the tree a little bit in recent years, but it used to own the culture of athleticism. And so you'd buy Nike to indicate that you're an athlete. And you'd buy ASICS if we're in the running category or sports category, because that would indicate that you're specifically a runner. The brands people are choosing now, and brands are popping up every day, are as much about self-promotion as they are about their actual value proposition.
So as a small business, brand loyalty, because a lot of small businesses don't even have a marketing department. So what can they do to, I guess, focus on building and expanding their brand loyalty, because it's hard to compete against the big end of town.
Well, it depends what their strategy is, if it's a scale strategy or depth strategy. And if they're smaller, they're probably better off staging that over time and moving into probably balancing both, actually. And I think that's one of the key differentiators for the way that we do things. The advice has always been just do one thing well, and we don't do that. We water the whole garden. So we look after the whole garden and we water it all very well. And so you'd probably look for quality of value for specific customers and doubling down on customer obsession with those. And then the other part that you'd balance is to make sure that you are constantly driving a funnel of awareness so that people become aware of you, and then use some of the social proof from your existing customers to then leverage into new fields or new customers.
I like that, watering the garden. That's a nice. I can visualize that. So, how is AI changing? And I know culture and branding are two different aspects, so it'll be two questions.
Sure.
How is AI going to change the way we manage culture and how we will manage our brands?
Well, again, AI is such a broad term, so we need to sort of look at what that means. Let's do it. Let's just talk about AI in terms of its ability to perform functions that humans can perform, and the possible duplication and results of that. So I'll stick with culture first. So the first thing is, organizations very soon are going to have to make a decision. Are they going to perpetuate the way that they make decisions, either for a large organization with shareholders or for profit, right? And that means if you can get it cheaper, you will. And so if that's the strategy, we'll see displacement of individuals very quickly, because AI will replace a lot of the programmatic tasks, less thinking based. Now, that won't work en masse for us societally. So if that happens across the nation and the globe, we'll have mass unemployment very quickly, and we'll move in the next 30 to 40 years into a minimum wage for families, because you won't be able to support yourself. Now, that's not a future anyone really wants to see. So I would hope that organizations, as they move into this next industrial revolution, start thinking about not just the shareholder return and profit curve, but start thinking about doing the right thing. And what is our societal and community responsibility in this? And whether it be brand or culture, we have a moral obligation. It can't just be about profit.
There was interesting you say that. There was a competition held in the US, and they called all these inventors because one of the problems with a robot, and I know a robot's different to AI, is that they can't turn a doorknob, like they can't actually open a door. So there's a lot of hysteria around, will AI replace us? So I like that you brought that up. So I think there is hope. And a lot of the things that we do is nuanced by creativity, which, you know, AI will have difficulty doing. So in terms of the innovations around, say, culture or branding, I'm sorry I'm putting them together, but it's because I know that you're an expert in both. What do you think is a more sort of a practical approach for small business? Because you could go out there and get a gazillion software, but it doesn't help, and you then end up getting software fatigue. So what do you think small to medium-sized businesses should be focusing in that realm?
So if they're looking to maximize, I'll leave brand alone for a minute, but if they're looking to maximize productivity through their culture, which is that sort of language is really helpful. So the more we talk about business and culture together and not well-being and culture together, well-being is part of it, but really for people to take notice and invest in this, and this is what we need, is any organization to invest in culture. They won't do that if it's just about a reduction of mental health and reducing churn. They will do it if they think it's going to accelerate and streamline their strategy. And that's exactly what good culture does. And we've seen that for decades. But a lot of companies haven't seen that. They don't really know what it is or what it means. So, which is part of our job. But what they could do, and what I think they should be doing, is looking at the productivity requirements of their organization and what the best investment is for each of those. And often with AI in place and a lot of the free tools that exist, it's very easy to be able to maximize your productivity by using a large language model to do in 10 seconds, you can get Jupyter or Jasper or Claude or any of them to write a marketing strategy for you, and then have that in a sequential, segmented manner. That would have taken your team, a team of people, probably 2 weeks. You know, they've got an AI. We work with a variety of data scientists, and one is particularly gifted, and he's working at 200 times his normal capacity every hour based on his use of AI. And he doesn't have to displace anyone. He still has a team around him, but the volume of work that he can create. Look, an interesting fact came out from Amazon recently where they said, we're not letting you publish more than 3 books a day. Now, no human is publishing 1 book in a month, let alone 3 books a day. So the tools are readily available, and they're largely inexpensive for organizations to expedite their productivity.
That is exciting. You've probably found that also, the amount of productivity, you know, that everybody can boost. It's fantastic. Yes. It's so empowering, and I love that. And I always think, if ever the grid went down, how will we work again? So
life could be better.
Life could be better. Exactly. More time surfing.
Yes.
So in terms of now, you're also a university lecturer, and what is your, I guess, view on how universities are teaching this area? So your area of expertise at university is brand and culture also, isn't it, and governance. So where do you see university education going with this?
So I've lectured at Sydney as a guest lecturer, and I'm an adjunct associate professor at Griffith, and I'm also an executive in residence at Griffith. And the idea or the interest in me has always been bringing the outside in, because I think those universities in particular know that if they keep their echo chambers alive and keep telling the same story, or don't evolve their syllabus, they cease being relevant. And we've seen that largely across universities. You only have to go into Google and write "university is" and let Google complete the sentence for you, and it's not very pretty. And look, the US election's another really great point, where we saw uneducated people making decisions because they didn't understand what policy is. So I think universities are evolving all the time to be more relevant or as relevant as they possibly can be. The changes that I've noticed is a lot of the theory that has been built into the curriculum and the syllabus is based on textbooks. And if you think about the process of change, and change may take 3 to 5 years historically, and change now takes 6 months. And I'll give you an example. It's very different to what it once was. So when I'm lecturing on brand, and particularly brand identity and strategy, and any small business will be saying, what should I be called? And what name can I come up with? And that used to be a particular process, which was competitive analysis, market analysis, value drivers of your customers. You'd start to get these sort of territories, creative territories of what you could be called, and then you would explore what's available or what the most appropriate is. Right now, there's no English word that's available for a brand name, pretty much. So you are calling your company Propeller Wizard or whatever it might be, because you can't call it. If you're selling push bike helmets, you can't call it helmet. You can't call it anything bike. You probably can't call it anything in French or Italian or Latin or Greek that says bike. You are coming up with something, essentially a nonsensical word, and then building relevance and understanding around that, rather than using it as the primary point of comprehension.
That's really impacted our use of language, hasn't it? The way that we brand. What's your thoughts on that? Do you think that is there going to come an inflection point where, like, how ridiculous can we get?
I think we're conditioning the world to be ridiculous, and that's the way it's going. As soon as Google and Alphabet showed up, you went, right, we're in a new world where you can call anything, and you start to make sense of it as you go, which is not traditional branding by any means. But I think if you look at the limitations if you look at the big limitations, they are domain availability and trademarking. So you can have a brand name if you'd like, but you won't be able to register it. And that defeats the purpose.
What's that say? Well, it's not a saying, it's actually rooted in research that, the start to the decline of a civilization is its decline in language. So, watch this space, I guess.
Yeah. There's a lot of threat to civilization at the moment.
There is. Well, that's a discussion for another time. I think we can talk about that next
Sure.
year.
Yeah,
I think that would be a really good topic. Would you? Yeah, would you be interested?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, we'll go there.
Okay.
In terms of hybrid work now,
yes.
how we were talking about pandemic, and we're still trying to make sense of a few things. We saw recently that, Amazon saying everyone back in the office, and then there's a whole heap of professional services firms that are trying to get people back into the office. They own expensive real estate, and that's understandable. What do you think the trend is? Because when I speak to different, I guess, whether they're a, C-suite or, team leader, they're all like, no, I'm not giving up my hybrid situation. What do you think will happen?
I think you need to look at why that's happening in the first place. I think a lot of large organizations are looking to downsize because of AI. So they're putting rules in place that are going to help people self-select out.
Okay.
I think that's the first thing. You're seeing the people with money in society are still generally of the older generation that believe that presenteeism is important. So shareholder meetings will be demanding that leaders are in place 5 days a week. These aren't really the reasons to make those decisions. The science is absolutely rock solid around the productivity benefits from a hybrid work existence. And from a culture perspective, you need to earn people's commute. You need to earn, why should I come in? You have to satisfy that question. It can't just be a mandate. So people will self-select off the back of that. As an interim solution, the better things that we're seeing are, for leaders in particular, full-time with flex, where, if you have to come in full-time, it's 5 days, but the flex, the flex consideration in that is you can agree on a contract with your leader around what that means for you. And full-time flex might actually mean 4 days a week, ideally. So my view on it from the research, and our research, is that hybrid work works. What is really difficult about it is the strategizing as to when to come in and why. You can't. There has to be a lot of thought that what organizations and leaders are not trained to do and not used to doing that explains right, if we're coming in 3 days a week, it probably needs to be these 3 days. And on these 3 days, we're doing these things. So it won't be deep work, for instance. You won't be sitting in an open plan environment trying to do deep work. Well, if you're there 5 days a week, you will be, but let's just make sure you've got some noise cancelling headphones, because the research and science on that is also very clear that the deepest work you'll do is in your home office if you're not encumbered by family.
I've noticed that too. I know several lawyers who have, they've downsized and they're partners and they're now working in an open office. So they then end up hogging the boardroom.
Yes.
Because they need that quiet time. So you're absolutely right. And we do a lot of work with organizations around remote work because they don't know how to communicate. Not that they don't know, well, they do know how to, they just don't have the proper structures in place.
Right.
So you're absolutely right. And it would definitely improve productivity, if they decided to put a better policy in place. In terms of the critical skills, so this is all sort of, spiraling into this topic of skills and leadership. There's a lot on leaders now to improve the way that they lead. Yeah. What do you think needs to change when it comes to leadership? And I'm not just speaking about, the C-suite, because there's different requirements. You've got C-suite, then you've got your management, then you've got your team leader. So what do you think needs to improve, or what predictions do you foresee we'll see changes in this area?
Okay, it's an enormous topic.
It is.
First thing across all levels is leaders, as are all people, are negatively impacted through technology, and the result of that is a decline in empathy and ability to recognize someone else's needs. So for an effective leader, that's step one, and you're up against it, because most of the time you're looking at a device around about you. You're not moving into someone else's existence. So, and it becomes a neurobiological conversation about the implications of the younger generation having so much time in technology and knowing full well that empathy grows through experience. So if they're not getting experience with other people, and the estimate is that they've got 1/3 less relational health than someone who's a Gen X, because we grew up talking to one another and others, whereas they grew up looking at a screen. And that's a real problem. And you can see that playing out all you need to do is have a conversation with a particularly affected 18 to 25-year-old who won't ask questions and won't be able to really follow a conversation if it isn't relating to them. Now, as a leader, your job is to not be about you, it's about others. So we have to really throw that out and ensure that whatever you can do from a training perspective, the idea that most leaders don't stop. They don't get an opportunity to stop. So they get up in the morning and they go. You can't really be curious about someone else's existence and build empathetic awareness and relational health if you don't stop. So we have to start creating opportunities and windows for leaders and all of us actually to stop and contemplate what we're doing and contemplate the needs and existence of others. That's probably the first thing. The second thing is just as we're seeing a greater class divide in many aspects in the world, we'll see that in education as well. So you'll still see recognition and onus on the Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, Stanfords as universities of excellence for certain people. Other people will want to cut corners and can cut corners very effectively and become more of a lifelong learner, not necessarily through a sandstone university or any university, but through their own learning journey. And, I'm someone that signs up to anything, any free moment that I might have. If I'm not creating something, I'm studying rocket science at the moment at Yale. So it's one of those things and I'm not an astrophysicist. I'm just someone who's interested in how rockets leave the Earth and what's that about. So there's so many things that are readily available. That's a free course too. There's many free courses that are just very interesting. Whether they're specific and valuable to your vocational path, that's a different conversation.
Yeah, that's so true. Like what you're saying is so spot on. Leaders are there to build people up, and let the people then build the systems and processes. Because otherwise, if you're trying to be the orchestra, the trombone player, the violin player, and conduct, Yeah, you've got chaos on your hands. Now, how do you measure the success of cultural initiatives? Because that's a hard one to measure sometimes. What do you think are the top three metrics that businesses should have in their
Yeah, well, firstly, I don't think it's hard.
sites? Okay.
I don't think it's difficult at all. I think the idea for people to say culture's hard takes a long time. I think that's half the problem. We've got to start believing that we can do this. So every company that's usually any sort of size will have an engagement score, employee engagement, because it relates specifically to productivity. So either the leader of the organization or the shareholders want to know how productive are my team, and engagement is the proxy for that.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. Is it any good for culture? It depends what's in the study. So a lot of them are, like, even the biggest studies from Gallup and Culture Amp, essentially 5 questions. But you can build those studies, those surveys yourself using any sort of AI tool and SurveyMonkey very cheaply to understand what is our base state, where are we starting from here, particularly around psychological safety. Do people feel very comfortable? Bringing their whole selves to work? Do they feel like they can ask questions without fear of retribution, make mistakes, show vulnerability? You can measure that because it's a survey. I think the other thing is, strategically, you get very clear on what you're trying to do and what type of strategy or type of culture and kind of strategy fit together. So if we have a growth strategy, you have a particular culture that needs to be adaptive, curious, collaborative, and results focused. Very clear. So with the right tools, I mean, we build one, but there's a variety of other things that you could use. You can measure what are the key influences on my culture. And for instance, if we know that's our strategy and there's the culture we need, we can then measure what are the influences of this particular leader on that culture. And if you've got a leader who's very organized and risk averse and analytical, you can be sure that they're not going to drive the culture in the way that's going to realize that strategic need.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, what do you think are what are your 5 predictions for next year for businesses? What do you think they need to bear in mind? So let's talk about for growth, because everybody wants to grow, whether it's a little bit or a lot.
Yeah. Well, AI will grow beyond anyone's expectation next year. You'll still hear people saying, oh, look, AI is a bit of a fizzle. It came and it's gone. It hasn't gone. So the better organizations, even smaller businesses, get really smart around the variety of AI tools that exist, and they invest heavily in them. So we're going to see that get to sort of that tipping point I mentioned before around what are you making decisions around in the next 18 months. So I think that's the first thing. Secondly, we're going to start seeing new educational opportunities coming from not the traditional higher education sector. You'll see there's a particular futurist, Thomas Frey, I think it is, who said the largest organization in the world in 30 years will be an education company that we've never heard of today. And I think that is true because the higher education system, of which I have run a business in and been part of, is beyond antiquated. So the reliance in Australia, particularly on international students and the way that we then build revenue, doesn't speak to the needs of the very busy, financially strapped individual that still needs to learn. So the lifelong learning path will accelerate in an incredible way in the next 12 months. Unfortunately, I think it's point 3. I think we'll start seeing a real divide between those organizations that have demanded people back in the office and those people that they've had more flexibility and more human perspective. In the short term, you'll start seeing higher productivity from those people in the office, but the long term, you will not be able to attract talent. So the better organizations will have a much more flexible working arrangement and a high level of trust culturally in their people, so that they trust them to work elsewhere. It's not even around strategically what are they doing or how do we enable that. It's just a level of, I trust you to be working I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt, which is actually the definition of psychological safety, that you're doing the right thing. And so we'll start to see that over time. That's only going to emerge towards the end of 12 to 18 months. And the older companies will be struggling because they can't get the right talent. If I had to go with 4 and 5, because I don't really know that I've got anything else, I would hope I would hope that the wellness movement and the statistics that are coming out from the insurance companies around psychological well-being or psychosocial injury will mean that organizations double down on looking after their people and realizing that we can't just keep squeezing and looking for a different result. We have to do things differently. And point 5 is very self-interested, but I would really hope that cultural leadership as a concept starts replacing some of the archaic leadership practices. And look, I've studied at Oxford, I've studied at a variety of universities. There's no cultural component of any of the leadership courses that I've studied in. And if you're going to Oxford University and studying executive leadership, and there's nothing in there about how to create, foster, and nurture culture, there's something really wrong. And it's not just that it's an old program. Earlier this year, I was involved in the development of another leadership program internationally out of the States. And I had to walk away from it because I said, where's culture? Like, how are we not? And there's just this mind blindness around the value of culture and the role of leadership. So I desperately hope that we get through to some of these people that think that they have the answer when they are so far away.
Very true, Karl. Now, Karl, where can somebody get in touch with you? What's the best way to reach out to you, especially if they need help with culture or brand?
So we're at capacity actually at the moment. So we're not taking any clients.
Yeah.
You can certainly join the Culture Institute, and we have like a free newsletter. And there's the Culture Institute is free, by the way. You join for free, but you get access to a lot of our material, frameworks, downloads, checklists. We have a code of conduct that is free that we think every organization should download and instigate through their company, which is around great cultural leadership and doing the right thing in a way that will actually drive results. And with brand, we're just in a position where we're underwater delivering what we need to at the moment. So I think that's probably the best advice, is to join the Culture Institute and keep up with us in that way.
And what's the site, the website?
Yep. That's just cultureinstitute.com.au.
Excellent. Fantastic. Karl, that was an amazing discussion. Thank you so much. I think this is really important topic for small, medium, even big size organizations to get their head around. And we'll get you back and we'll have that deeper conversation.
Yep. Terrific.
Thank you, Karl.
Thanks, Diana. Thank you very much.